people and send a message. So what do we do about this changing face of terror? Let's bring in our guest. Joining us now is Tim Clemente, a former FBI counterterror investigator and special agent. Tim, talk to me about this changing face of terror. It seems almost impossible to imagine that we could put our finger on every single suspect like these that we're seeing now. But on the other hand, it seems like these folks, whether the Tsarnaev brothers or these latest guys, they make themselves known in a community, and there have been warning signs. What do we do about this?
Well, SC, it's a very difficult situation. These guys are radicalized, and this guy within the last decade became radicalized. But again, we don't have laws against radical thought. We don't have laws against believing in particular things. And we are at war. We're at war with an ideology that once it exhibits itself in violence, that's when they're crossing the threshold, and now they're committing criminal acts that they can be investigated for. But just holding these beliefs, unfortunately, under our laws, and I believe in the UK, it's not something that the FBI or other investigative bodies can investigate them for. Yeah. So we're going to need to we're going to need to look more closely at this, because this ideology is not going away. I know the president may have spoken about, the duration of the war on terror. The war on terror wasn't started by us, and it will only be ended by us if we can end this ideology, this radical Islamist belief system that they can kill wantonly anyone they believe is their enemy.
Hey, Tim, this is Will Kane. I wish I would have thought of this question earlier today. It just occurred to me during SE's setup. Oftentimes during some of the stories we do, we've seen it recently, for example, with the tornado in Oklahoma. We presume that tornadoes are on the rise because we just watched this horrible thing happen, when in fact we know this was the lowest season for tornadoes in quite some years. Same thing with mass shootings after Sandy Hook or gun crime in general. We see the current news event. We think this is a rash of things that are happening. I don't have any statistics. This is why I said I wish I would have thought of this earlier today. Do you know, are these one-off jihadi-inspired, Islamist, extremist-inspired attacks, are these on the rise, or are we just more aware of them?
No, I don't believe they're on the rise. I believe this tactic has been around for decades, and it will continue to be around. Beheadings especially. It's something that Zarqawi was very fond of doing to hostages in Iraq, Daniel Pearl in 2002. You can go back for a long time and see this same type of attack, where they grab somebody and they use their own cameras ordinarily. That's the way Al-Qaeda did in Iraq, and that's the way they've done it in other circumstances. They like to televise their terror. In Yemen, when the USS Cole was blown up, unfortunately the cameraman had fallen asleep and forgot to record the event. But what these guys did yesterday was use a new phenomenon, and that new phenomenon is the fact that every individual out there is a videographer. Every cell phone has a video camera. So now these guys can go in any public place, do an attack like this, stand around and know they're going to get that pulpit.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, there's a number of things here. One is that the British have actually gotten a lot better at counter-radicalization efforts over time, largely because of things like the 7/7 bombing, and there's been a recognition in Great Britain this is a very serious threat. You mentioned Al-Muhajiroon, which is Anjem Chowdhury's outfit, the Finsbury Park Mosque. I mean, this was a place that had connections to radical Islam and Al-Qaeda all over the world.
And Chowdhury actually came out to say he was very surprised by this, would not recommend people do it, but he also will not condemn it.
Right, he won't condemn it, but there was a time when he would have been out in front saying this was a great idea. Now the Brits will actually kick you out of the country for that. Right. And by the way, the Brits aren't the only ones dealing with this. Right now in Sweden, there are massive riots. Police are getting pummeled with rocks. They are lighting cars on fire. It's always reported as immigrants. No, this is Muslim rioting in predominantly Muslim neighborhoods. This assimilation issue is something that not just the Brits, but the Europeans in general are having a very tough time with.
And I'd like to add, too, that while in this country we don't criminalize ideology, in the UK, they're much tougher on it. As you mentioned, these groups are banned. These preachers are kicked out of the country if they're found to be inciting an extremist. But I do want to add one note about Prime Minister David Cameron. I loved the fact that he came out right away and said that this was an act of terror. And it's being reported today that Brits are putting on the Heroes T-shirt that this gentleman was wearing yesterday in solidarity.
Right. Will goes right to the point of this. When you talk about whether it's a rise in the numbers or rise in the reporting, the fact is, whether it's the filming of a woman being stoned to death and put on YouTube, a neighborhood taking apart houses in India with a Muslim neighborhood, they are affiliated by their ideology. It's now that we see the rogue attacks come into the United States. I have spent probably close to 15 years with a number of experts leading up to this point where we have told you it's coming. The Chechen terrorists, the fact that Moussaoui was a recruiter for the Chechen rebels. You start to see this. It's that it's expanding here. It happens every day in Nigeria. It happens every day around the world in India. It happens in China, where there are 50 million Muslims. This is a problem with an ideology and a radical form of an ideology.
And Tim, let me get back to you. I want to play a quick sound from President Obama today, who seemed to acknowledge this changing face of al-Qaeda and jihad.
And the best way to prevent violent extremism inspired by violent jihadists is to work with the Muslim American community, which has consistently rejected terrorism, to identify signs of radicalization and partner with law enforcement when an individual is drifting towards violence. And these partnerships can only work when we recognize that Muslims are a fundamental part of the American family.
Tim, we're almost out of time, so briefly, do you think that that's the right approach, relying on the Muslim community?
I think we do need to rely on the Muslim community. I would have to agree with the president somewhat in what he just said, because without the Muslims, they're the first responders to this. They're the ones that are immediately see radicalization, and unfortunately, they haven't responded to it within their community yet. They're beginning to, I believe, and I believe that's what's going to be required for us to really stifle this ideology from growing.
Yeah, I agree as well. Tim, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
After the break, did she or didn't she? Did the IRS's